Employee discriminates against Will Smith in expensive store. The actor's reaction went viral. On a warm Los Angeles afternoon, Will Smith was exhausted. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from spending 14 hours on a movie set, repeating the same intense emotional scene over and over until it was perfect. His muscles ached, and his mind yearned for the comfort of his bed. But he had promised himself he'd get this errand done today. "You sure you don't want me to come with you?" his assistant Jake asked, concern evident in his voice as they sat in the parked car outside the high-end shopping district. "I can grab whatever you need." Will shook his head, managing a tired smile. "Nah, man. Sometimes I just need to feel normal, you know? Do regular things like everyone else." Jake nodded, though his expression remained worried. "At least let me park and wait. Go home." Will insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "It's been a long day for you too. I'll catch an Uber back if I need to." As Jake reluctantly pulled away from the curb, Will stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the familiar sight of Rodeo Drive. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows. Between the palm trees and well-dressed shoppers strolled past with their designer bags. Nobody seemed to notice him yet. A rare moment of anonymity that he treasured. He'd deliberately chosen to dress down today, wearing a comfortable gray hoodie, well-worn jeans, and his favorite pair of Nike sneakers. No sunglasses, no security, no entourage. Just a man going shopping like anybody else. The first store he entered was Hermes. A friendly saleswoman named Maria immediately recognized him and provided attentive but respectful service. He browsed their selection but didn't find quite what he was looking for. "Perhaps try Gucci," Maria suggested helpfully. "They just got in their new collection of leather goods." Will thanked her warmly. As he left the store, a teenager approached, him tentatively. "Mr. Smith? I'm sorry to bother you, but could I maybe get a picture?" Will's exhaustion melted away as he smiled at the young fan. "Of course. What's your name?" "Trevor," the boy replied, his hands shaking slightly as he held up his phone. Will put his arm around Trevor's shoulders. "Trevor, my man, let's make this a good one. You gotta smile bigger than that. There you go." After taking the photo and chatting briefly with Trevor and his mother, Will continued down the street. These were the moments he loved. Simple, genuine interactions with regular people. It reminded him of his own roots, of the young man from Philadelphia who'd once dreamed of making it big. The Gucci store stood proudly on the corner, its windows displaying the latest collection. As Will approached the entrance, an elderly couple was struggling with the heavy door. Without hesitation, he hurried forward to hold it open for them. "Thank you, young man," the woman said warmly, not recognizing him in the growing dusk. Such nice manners are rare these days. Will grinned. "My mama would have my hide if I didn't help, ma'am." Inside, the store was quieter than he expected for this time of day. Soft classical music played through hidden speakers, and the lighting created an intimate, exclusive atmosphere. A few other customers browsed the displays, speaking in hushed tones. Two sales associates stood near the front counter. The older one, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes, was showing something on the computer to her younger colleague. Will could hear her patient explanations about the inventory system. He made his way to the men's section, running his fingers along the supple leather of a display bag. The craftsmanship was excellent, exactly the kind of quality he was looking for. As he examined different pieces, he overheard snippets of conversation from nearby. "Did you see the price of these shoes?" A young woman whispered to her friend. "My rent is less than that." Her friend giggled. "Girl, that's why we're just window shopping." Will smiled to himself, remembering similar conversations with his friends back in the day. He'd come a long way from those times, but he never wanted to forget them. A young sales associate, his name tag read Marcus, had been watching Will since he entered. At first, Will didn't think much of it. He was used to being observed in public spaces, but there was something different about the way Marcus followed his movements, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Still, Will continued, browsing, determined to find the perfect graduation gift. He'd been thinking about this for weeks. Jaden's entire class was graduating, and Will wanted to do something special. These kids had grown up together, supported each other, and now they were heading off to different colleges. A quality briefcase seemed like the perfect symbolic gift. Something practical, but also meaningful. He picked up a particularly handsome leather briefcase in deep brown, admiring the subtle logo and clean lines. This could be the one. As he turned it over to check the details, he heard rapid footsteps approaching. "Sir!" Marcus's voice cut through the quiet store like a whip. "That bag is $4,000. Will looked up, startled by the aggressive tone. Marcus stood uncomfortably close, his body language tense and hostile. "I can see that," Will replied calmly, though his heart had begun to beat faster. He knew what was coming, had experienced it too many times before, even after all these years of fame. Marcus reached out and actually grabbed the briefcase from Will's hands. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a different store. There's a mall about 15 minutes from here with more suitable options." The words hung in the air like poison. Several nearby customers stopped what they were doing, their eyes wide with recognition and disbelief. Someone gasped. The older sales associate at the counter looked up sharply. Will stood very still, feeling the familiar rush of emotions. Anger, hurt, humiliation. But underneath it all was a deep, deep tiredness. Not just from the long day of filming, but from the weight of these moments that never seemed to end. No matter how successful he became, no matter what he achieved. He noticed a young woman in the corner already had her phone out, recording. Part of him wanted to walk away, to avoid becoming another viral moment of racial profiling. But a stronger part of him knew he had to stay, not just for himself, but for every other person who had ever been made to feel less than human in spaces like this. The air in the store felt electric now, charged with tension. Will could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he slowly reached for his wallet, maintaining eye contact with Marcus. The young man's expression flickered between contempt and uncertainty, clearly beginning to realize he might have made a terrible mistake. The stage was set. In this moment, Will knew his reaction would define not just this interaction, but potentially become a teaching moment for millions. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders as he prepared to respond to this blatant discrimination in a way that would make his mother proud. Every eye in the store was on them now, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence stretched thin as a wire, ready to snap. The silence was broken by the soft thud of Will's wallet landing on the glass display case. His Platinum American Express card gleamed under the store lights. "You know what hurts the most?" Will's voice was quiet, but carried through the hushed store. "It's not the assumption that I can't afford it. I've dealt with that my whole life. It's the fact that you didn't even try to hide your disgust." Marcus's eyes darted between the card and Will's face, recognition finally dawning in his features. Color drained from his face as he stammered. "Mr. Smith, I didn't—" "Yes, you did," Will interrupted, his tone firm but controlled. "You knew exactly what you were doing. The question is, why?" An older woman shopping nearby spoke up, her voice trembling with anger. "I saw the whole thing. It's absolutely disgraceful. Do you know who this is?" "Ma'am?" Will turned to her with a gentle smile. "With all due respect, it shouldn't matter who I am. This shouldn't happen to anyone, famous or not." The older sales associate who had been at the counter hurried over, horror written across her face. "Mr. Smith, I am so terribly sorry. Marcus is new and What's your name?" Will asked her. "Sarah Chen. I'm the store manager," she replied, wringing her hands. "Ms. Chen, please don't apologize for him," Will said, maintaining his composure despite the emotions churning inside. "But I would like to know if this is how all your customers are treated." Other customers had gathered closer now, many openly recording on their phones. A young black couple near the entrance had stopped their shopping, watching the scene unfold with painful recognition in their eyes. "I came in here today," Will continued, his voice growing stronger, to buy graduation gifts. 27 briefcases for my son's entire graduating class. I chose this store because I believed in the quality of your products and the experience you provide. He paused, looking directly at Marcus. Tell me, how many sales have you lost because you decided someone wasn't good enough to shop here? Marcus shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. Sir, I really didn't. Didn't what? Will pressed. Didn't know it was me? Would it have been okay if I was just another black man in a hoodie? A teenage girl in the corner wiped tears from her eyes as she recorded. Her mother stood beside her, hand on her shoulder, both of them transfixed by the scene. Sarah Chen stepped forward again. Mr. Smith, please allow me to handle this situation. Marcus, go to my office immediately. No, Will said firmly, surprising everyone. I want him to stay. In fact, he picked up the briefcase that had started it all. I want him to help me select 26 more just like this one. And while we do that, we're going to have a conversation about why this happened. The tension in the store shifted. This wasn't going the way anyone expected. There was no shouting, no demands for firing, no viral outburst. Instead, they were witnessing something far more powerful, a moment of potential transformation. But first, Will said, pulling out his phone, I need to make a quick call. He dialed and waited. Hey, Jake? Yeah, I'm gonna need you to come back with the car. We've got quite a few items to transport. He paused, listening. No, everything's not okay. But maybe it will be. As he ended the call, Will turned back to Marcus, whose arrogant demeanor had completely crumbled, replaced by visible shame and fear. Now, Will said, gesturing to the briefcase display. Shall we begin? The next few minutes were tense as Marcus, under Sarah Chen's watchful eye, began showing different briefcase options. His hands trembled as he pulled out each style, his voice barely above a whisper as he described the features. Speak up, Will encouraged, not unkindly. Tell me why you love working here. Tell me about these products you're so quick to decide who can and cannot buy. Gradually, other customers resumed their shopping, though everyone kept one ear tuned to the ongoing interaction. The young black couple had decided to stay, watching with a mixture of pride and vindication as Will Smith turned what could have been an ugly confrontation into something else entirely. The store's atmosphere had transformed into something electric, something meaningful. This wasn't just about a celebrity being discriminated against. It was about a moment of reckoning, about facing uncomfortable truths and choosing how to respond to them. And as Will Smith stood there, exhausted but determined, he knew that what happened next would matter far beyond the walls of this luxury store on Rodeo Drive. The silence in the Gucci store felt heavy enough to touch. Will Smith stood there, his American Express card still gleaming on the counter, as every eye in the store focused on him. The tension wasn't just in the air. It was written in every muscle of his body, every controlled breath he took. Mr. Smith, Marcus began, his voice barely audible. I can explain. Can you? Will's voice remained steady, though his hands had balled into fists inside his hoodie pocket. I'm genuinely curious what explanation you have for treating another human being this way. A woman browsing nearby muttered under her breath. This is going straight to corporate. She was still recording on her phone, along with several other customers who had gathered in a loose semicircle around the scene. Sarah Chen, the store manager, stepped forward again. Marcus, perhaps you should stay right where you are. Will interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. We're going to do this differently. He picked up the briefcase that had sparked the confrontation. Tell me about this piece. Marcus swallowed. Hard. His previous contempt replaced by visible anxiety. It's from our new collection. Full-grain leather with palladium finish hardware. Good. Will nodded. Now tell me why you thought I couldn't afford it. The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Was it the hoodie? Will pressed, plucking at his gray sweatshirt. The jeans. Or was it something else? Something you don't want to say out loud. An elderly gentleman who had been examining wallets nearby spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. I've been shopping here for 30 years, and I've never seen such disgraceful behavior. Sir. Will turned to him with a gentle smile. Thank you, but please, let him answer. Marcus's face had gone from pale to flushed, sweat beading on his forehead. Mr. Smith, I really didn't mean— Yes, you did. Will cut him off. But there was something different in his voice now. Not anger, but a deep sadness. You meant every word, every gesture. What you didn't mean was for me to be Will Smith. A young black couple who had been watching from near the entrance exchanged knowing looks. The woman stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. This happened to us last week at a different store. Nobody said anything then. Will turned to them, his expression softening. Would you mind sharing what happened? The woman, who introduced herself as Tanya, nodded. My husband James and I were shopping for our anniversary. The sales associate followed us around the store, then suggested we might be more comfortable somewhere else. She paused, wiping a tear. We left. We just left. Not today, Will said firmly. He turned back to Marcus. Today, we're going to handle this differently. You're going to sell me 27 briefcases. And while you do, we're going to have an honest conversation about why this keeps happening. A murmur went through the gathered crowd. Sarah Chen stepped forward again, this time with a different energy. Mr. Smith, please allow me to help with this purchase as well. We can— No, Will said quietly. Marcus needs to do this. Every transaction. Every briefcase. Because this isn't about the sale anymore. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Jake? Yeah. I need you to tell Jada I'll be late. Something came up. Something important. He paused, listening. No, I'm okay. But I need to be here. As he ended the call, Will noticed more people had gathered outside the store windows, phones pressed against the glass. Word was spreading. He could already imagine the social media posts, the viral videos, the headlines that would follow. But that wasn't why he was staying. Marcus, he said, his voice taking on a teacher's patience. Show me the other briefcase options. All of them. And while you do, let's talk about what happened here today. Marcus moved mechanically toward the display, his earlier arrogance completely shattered. As he began pulling out different briefcases, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped one. Careful, Will said, steadying the briefcase. These are expensive, remember? A few nervous laughs broke the tension, but the atmosphere remained charged. Tanya and James, the couple from earlier, had moved closer, now standing near Will in silent support. The problem, Will continued, examining each briefcase Marcus showed him, isn't just what happened here today. It's that it happens every day, everywhere, to people who don't have the platform I have. He turned to address the growing crowd in the store. How many of you have experienced something like this? Several hands went up, mostly belonging to people of color. An Asian woman in her 60s spoke up. Last month, at a jewelry store, they asked to see my ID before they'd show me anything. 3 weeks ago, a young black man added, security followed me through an entire department store. Will nodded, turning back to Marcus. Are you listening? Really listening? Marcus stood frozen, the reality of the moment finally seeming to hit him. I never thought. That's the problem, Will said softly. You never thought about it. You never had to. Sarah Chen, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward with a stack of papers. Mr. Smith, I've prepared the purchase orders for all 27 briefcases. Thank you. Will nodded. Marcus will process them, one at a time. And while he does, he turned back to the young sales associate. While you do, I want you to look at each person in this store who just shared their story. Really look at them. These are the people you've been turning away. These are the sales you've lost. These are the human beings you've hurt. Marcus's hands trembled as he began processing the first briefcase. The store had grown even more crowded, but now there was a different energy. Something between a church service and a classroom. Mr. Smith. A teenage girl spoke up from the back, her voice breaking. My mom and I, we shop here sometimes, but they always follow us around too. Will's expression softened as he looked at her. What's your name, sweetheart? Ashley, she replied, wiping her eyes. Ashley, I want you to know something. Will's voice carried through the store. You belong anywhere you want to be. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise. As Marcus continued processing the sales, his movements mechanical and his face ashen, Will maintained a steady conversation with the gathered crowd. People shared their stories, not just of retail discrimination, but of all the small daily indignities they'd faced. See, Marcus, Will said as the young man processed the 10th briefcase. This is bigger than just today. This is about a pattern that needs to break. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. News vans were beginning to arrive, their lights visible through the store windows. Social media was already exploding with clips of the interaction. But inside the store, something remarkable was happening. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to something else. Something like healing. People were talking to each other, sharing experiences, listening. Even those who had never experienced profiling firsthand were beginning to understand. Marcus's hands had stopped shaking by the 15th briefcase, but now tears were rolling down his face. Mr. Smith, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything right now, Will replied. Just listen, learn, and remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on how they look. Sarah Chen had been making calls, presumably to corporate headquarters. The news about what was happening in her store had clearly reached the higher-ups, but Will wasn't concerned about that. His focus remained on the human element of what was unfolding. As Marcus processed the 20th briefcase, Will turned to Tanya and James, who had stayed throughout the entire interaction. Next time something like this happens, he said, remember this moment. Remember that you have every right to be anywhere you choose to be. The couple nodded, both of them fighting back tears. Around them, phones were still recording, but the atmosphere had transformed from sensational to sacred. This wasn't just about a celebrity being discriminated against anymore. It had become something much more profound. By the time Marcus reached the final briefcase, his transformation was visible. The arrogant young man who had snatched a bag from Will Smith's hands was gone, replaced by someone who looked both humbled and haunted. Will pulled out his credit card for the final transaction. The total amount was staggering, over $100,000. But the real value of what had transpired in that store couldn't be measured in dollars. I want you to remember something, Will said to Marcus as he signed the last receipt. This isn't about humiliating you. It's about growth. What you do with this experience is up to you. The store had fallen completely silent, every person hanging on his words. Outside, the media circus was growing, but inside, a different kind of story had unfolded. One about confronting bias, about choosing education over anger, about the possibility of change. As Will prepared to deal with the chaos that awaited him outside, he turned one last time to the gathered crowd. Thank you all for being part of this moment. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones. Marcus stood behind the counter, the stack of receipts in his trembling hands, tears still streaming down his face. The transformation was complete, but the real work, the work of changing hearts and minds, was just beginning. The story of what happened in that Gucci store was about to go viral, but the real impact wasn't in the headlines or social media posts. It was in the quiet revelations, the shared stories, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, one small moment of discrimination had been transformed into something meaningful and lasting. As Will looked around the store one final time, he noticed an older black woman in the corner. She hadn't spoken throughout the entire interaction, but tears were streaming down her face. She caught his eye and nodded slowly, a gesture full of understanding and gratitude. "Mr. Smith," Marcus spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "The delivery address for the briefcases." "Right," Will said, turning back to the counter. "They'll need to be delivered to—" He was interrupted by a commotion at the store entrance. Jake, his assistant, had arrived and was trying to make his way through the crowd that had gathered outside. "Will," Jake called out, finally pushing through. "It's crazy out there. TMZ is here, and I think I saw CNN pulling up." Will nodded calmly. "That's all right. We're almost done here." He turned back to Marcus. "Let me give you the delivery details." As Will wrote down the address for his son's school, Marcus gathered the courage to speak again. "Mr. Smith, I need to tell you something." The store fell silent once more, all eyes turning to the young sales associate. "My grandfather," Marcus's voice cracked. "He owned a small shop in Alabama. In the 60s, he wouldn't serve black customers. I grew up hearing his stories, his justifications. I thought I was different, better somehow. But today I realized I'm just carrying his legacy in a designer suit." Will stopped writing and looked up. The rawness of Marcus's confession hung in the air. "The difference," Will said carefully, "is that your grandfather probably never had a moment like this, a chance to see the impact of his actions, to choose a different path." Tanya, who was still standing nearby with her husband James, spoke up. "Will you choose differently?" Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. "Yes," he whispered. "God, yes." Sarah Chen stepped forward again, holding some papers. "Mr. Smith, I've been on the phone with our corporate office. They want to issue a formal apology and—" "No," Will interrupted gently. "No press releases, no corporate statements. This isn't about publicity or damage control. This is about human beings treating each other with dignity." The teenage girl, Ashley, who had spoken earlier, raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Smith, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. How do you stay so calm? If that happened to me, I'd be so angry." Will took a deep breath, considering her question. "I am angry, Ashley. I'm angry that in 2025 we're still dealing with this. I'm angry that my children have to face the same prejudices I faced. But anger alone doesn't create change." He gestured around the store. "Look at what happened here. Today, if I had gotten angry, yelled, demanded Marcus be fired, what would that have accomplished? Instead, we had a conversation. People shared their stories. Maybe, just maybe, some minds were changed." Jake cleared his throat. "Will, we really need to think about how we're going to handle the media outside." "They can wait," Will replied, firmly. He turned back to Marcus. "We're not quite done here." Marcus looked up, surprised. "Sir? I want you to think about something," Will said, leaning on the counter. "Every time you look at one of these briefcases in the future, I want you to remember today. Remember how it felt to judge someone based on their appearance. Remember how it felt to be wrong. And remember how it felt to be given a chance to learn from it." The older black woman, who had been watching silently, finally spoke up. "My husband was turned away from a store like this in 1962, she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "He never got an explanation, never got a chance to speak his piece. He just had to walk away with his dignity in tatters. What happened here today? This is what healing looks like." Will smiled at her warmly. "Thank you for sharing that, ma'am. This is exactly why we can't let this just be another viral moment. It has to mean something more." Sarah Chen, who had been quietly observing, suddenly straightened up. "Mr. Smith, if you'll permit me, I'd like to implement a new training program. Not just the corporate diversity training we already have, but real conversations, real stories, like what happened here today." Will nodded approvingly. "Now that's how change happens. One person, one store, one moment at a time. The final delivery details were arranged, and Jake had managed to coordinate with security for a safe exit through the back of the store. As Will prepared to leave, Marcus spoke up one last time. "Mr. Smith, thank you. Not for buying the briefcases, but for not giving up on me when you had every right to." Will paused, then reached across the counter to shake Marcus's hand. "We're all works in progress, man. The important thing is to keep progressing." As Will made his way toward the back exit, customers parted to let him through, many reaching out to touch his arm or whisper thanks. The energy in the store had completely transformed from the tense, angry atmosphere of hours earlier. Tanya and James stepped forward one last time. "Mr. Smith," James said, "next time someone treats us like that in a store, we'll remember this. We won't just walk away." Will smiled. "Just remember, the goal isn't to shame people. It's to change them." Before leaving, Will turned to address the store one final time. "Thank you all for being part of this moment. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the most necessary ones." As he finally stepped out into the California evening, where news, crews and paparazzi waited, Will felt exhausted but hopeful. What had started as a simple shopping trip had turned into something much more significant. A moment of confrontation transformed into an opportunity for growth. The story would indeed go viral, but the real impact wasn't in the headlines or social media posts. It was in the quiet revelations that had occurred in that store, in the minds that had been opened, and in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, one small moment of discrimination had been transformed into a catalyst for change. Back inside, Marcus stood at the counter, looking at the stack of receipts, each one a reminder of a lesson learned in the most unexpected way. And around him, customers continued to share their stories, turning a luxury store into a space for healing, understanding, and hope. Sarah Chen had never run so fast in her designer heels. The security feed playing on her office monitor showed everything. The confrontation, the gathering crowd, the phones recording what could become a PR nightmare. But it was Will Smith's expression that made her heart sink. The quiet dignity in the face of such blatant discrimination. "Oh God, she muttered, grabbing her store keys and employee manual. Her mind raced through corporate protocols, media management procedures, and the dozen calls she'd need to make. But first, she had to get out there. As she burst out of her office, she nearly collided with Janet, one of her senior sales associates. "Did you see?" Janet started. Yes. How long has this been going on?" "About 10 minutes. The videos are already hitting Twitter. I mean, X." Sarah smoothed her blazer, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "Call corporate. Use the crisis management line. I need to get out there." The main floor of the store had transformed in the 20 minutes she'd been reviewing security footage. The usual quiet, refined atmosphere was charged with tension. Customers stood in small clusters, phones raised, watching the scene unfold. Near the leather goods section, Will Smith's voice carried clearly across the store. "Young man, I want you to handle my entire purchase today. Every briefcase, every transaction." Sarah stopped short, processing his words. This wasn't following any crisis management protocol she'd ever studied. The celebrity wasn't storming out, wasn't threatening lawsuits, wasn't demanding anyone be fired. He was teaching? "Mr. Smith," she called out, approaching the scene. "Please, let me handle this situation." She shot a stern look at Marcus, who stood pale and trembling behind the counter. "We take these incidents very seriously, and I assure you." Will raised his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Ms. Chen, right? Please, there's no need to apologize for him." "But sir, our policy clearly states." "Policies don't change hearts," Will interrupted gently. "Actions do. Conversations do." He turned back to Marcus. "Now, about those briefcases. Show me your full collection." Sarah watched in amazement as Will Smith, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, began examining luxury briefcases with the sales associate who had just discriminated against him. The tension in the store shifted, becoming something else entirely. Her phone buzzed. Corporate was calling. She stepped aside to answer it. Ms. Chen. Her regional manager's voice was tense. We're seeing social media activity. Yes, sir. I'm handling it. Do we need to send in the crisis team? Legal is standing by. Sarah watched as Will engaged Marcus in conversation, asking about the craftsmanship of each piece, all while maintaining an underlying dialogue about prejudice and assumptions. No, she said firmly. I don't think we do. Something different is happening here. Different how? Sir, I think we're witnessing a masterclass in human dignity. She ended the call and moved closer to hear the conversation. Marcus was explaining the features of a particular briefcase, his voice still shaky. The leather is full-grain Italian, sir. Each piece is hand-stitched. Good. Will nodded. Now tell me, when I first walked in, what did you see? Not. Will Smith, what did you see when you looked at me? The store fell silent again. A woman nearby wiped tears from her eyes. Sarah had managed hundreds of crisis situations in her retail career. But this was different. This wasn't about damage control or liability. This was about human beings confronting uncomfortable truths. Mr. Smith, she spoke up again. Would you allow me to join this conversation? Not as a manager, but as someone who has worked in luxury retail for 20 years. Will turned to her, interest flickering in his eyes. Of course. Sarah took a deep breath. I've seen this before. Too many times. We have diversity training, inclusion workshops, corporate policies. But we've never done this. We've never just talked about it. That's exactly right, Will said, addressing not just her but the entire store. We're so busy managing these situations that we forget to address the human cost. A young black woman in the crowd spoke up. Last month, I saved up for 3 months to buy a bag here. The security guard followed me around the whole time. Did you report it? Sarah asked, her stomach sinking. Would it have made a difference? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah felt the weight of every unaddressed complaint, every customer who had swallowed their dignity and walked away. It will now, she said firmly. Starting today, things will be different. Will smiled approvingly. Change starts with acknowledgement. Marcus, how many briefcases have we processed so far? 7, sir. Marcus replied quietly. 20 more to go. Plenty of time for honest conversation. Sarah watched as Marcus's hands shook less with each transaction. The young man's arrogance had been replaced by something else. Awareness, perhaps. Or the beginning of understanding. She pulled out her phone again, but this time not to call corporate. Instead, she opened her notes app and began writing. Implement monthly open forums for staff and customers. Review security protocols with anti-bias focus. Create anonymous reporting system for customers. Develop local community outreach program. Mr. Smith, she said, looking up from her notes. Would you be willing to share your thoughts on how we can do better? Not for publicity, but for real change. Will considered her question while examining another briefcase. The first step is acknowledging that luxury shouldn't mean exclusivity based on anything other than the ability to pay. The second is understanding that every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, regardless of what they're wearing or what you think they can afford. A teenage girl who had been recording the entire interaction raised her hand tentatively. My mom and I come here sometimes. They always watch us too, but we never said anything. Why not? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Because we didn't think it would matter. Sarah felt the words like a physical blow. How many customers had felt the same way? How many had simply accepted this treatment as the cost of shopping while black? It matters now, she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. I give you my word. It matters now. The next hour passed in what felt like a sacred space. As Marcus continued processing the briefcases, people shared their stories. Sarah listened, really listened, taking notes not just with her phone, but with her heart. Will maintained his calm presence throughout, turning what could have been a devastating, viral moment into something constructive. He asked questions, shared his own experiences, and gently guided the conversation toward understanding rather than accusation. "Ms. Chen," he said as Marcus neared the end of the transactions, "what happens tomorrow matters more than what happened today." She nodded, understanding the responsibility he was placing on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one incident or one employee. This was about systematic change. "I know," she replied, "and we'll do better, not because of social media or corporate pressure, but because it's right." As the final briefcase was processed, Sarah looked around her store. The space felt different now, transformed by truth-telling and the courage to confront uncomfortable realities. Marcus, who had been quiet for several minutes, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Smith, Ms. Chen, I need to say something." The store fell silent once again. "I've worked in luxury retail for 3 years," he began, his voice trembling. "And I've done this before. Many times. I never had to face the consequences, never had to hear the stories, never had to see the pain I was causing." Will leaned on the counter, giving Marcus his full attention. "And now that you have, I want to be part of the change," Marcus said, looking at Sarah. If I still have a job." Sarah met his gaze. "You do. But with a new responsibility. Starting next week, you'll be helping me implement these changes. Your first assignment is to document everything that happened here today. Not for corporate, but for training. Real training." The atmosphere in the store had shifted completely from the tension of hours earlier. What had started as a moment of discrimination had transformed into something powerful, a catalyst for change. As Will prepared to leave, Sarah stepped forward one last time. "Mr. Smith, thank you, not just for how you handled this, but for showing us a better way. Just remember," he replied, looking around at the gathered crowd, "this isn't about one store or one incident. It's about changing the conversation. It's about making sure that the next person who walks through those doors feels welcome, regardless of what they're wearing or how they look." Sarah nodded, clutching her notes like a promise. Tomorrow would bring media inquiries, corporate meetings, and probably some difficult conversations. But today had brought something more valuable, a chance to do better, to be better. The story would indeed go viral, but the real impact wouldn't be measured in views or shares. It would be measured in the changes that followed, in the conversations that continued, and in the dignity that would be honored in all who entered those doors. As Will finally left the store, Sarah turned to her staff and customers. "Thank you all for being part of this moment. Now, let's make sure it becomes more than just a moment." And in that high-end store on Rodeo Drive, something had shifted. Not just in policy or procedure, but in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed. A masterclass in turning discrimination into dialogue and conflict into change. The store's atmosphere had shifted, but Sarah Chen's work was far from over. As she watched Will Smith prepare to leave, she pulled out her phone one more time. Not to call corporate, but to begin documenting the promises she'd made. "Marcus," she called out, "come here for a moment." The young sales associate approached cautiously, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Yes, Ms. Chen? I meant what I said about you helping with the changes. But first, I need to understand. What made you act that way today?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. The store had quieted, many customers still lingering, watching this aftermath unfold. He started, then stopped. Taking a deep breath, he tried again. "I was taught that this is how you protect high-end merchandise. Profile certain people, make assumptions. I never questioned it. And now? Now I feel ashamed," he whispered. "Not just because it was Will Smith, but because of all the stories I heard today. All the people I've probably hurt without ever knowing." A young woman who had been shopping nearby approached them. "Can I say something?" Sarah nodded encouragingly. "I work at another luxury store down the street. she said. We do the same thing. We're trained to do it subtly, but we do it. After today, I don't think I can anymore. Will Smith, who had been signing the final receipts, looked up. That's how change spreads. One person, one decision at a time. Sarah turned to address her entire staff, who had gathered around during the past few hours. Starting tomorrow, we implement new protocols. No more following customers around. No more assumptions. No more subtle discrimination. But what about loss prevention? Someone asked. We'll figure it out, Sarah replied firmly. There are ways to protect merchandise without compromising human dignity. Will nodded approvingly. The cost of lost merchandise is nothing compared to the cost of lost humanity. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes as she thought about all the times she'd looked the other way, all the times she'd prioritized protocol over people. Mr. Smith, she said, her voice thick with emotion, before you go, would you be willing to help us draft some initial guidelines, something real, not corporate speak? Will checked his watch, then smiled. I think I can spare a few more minutes. For the next half hour, they huddled around the counter. Will Smith, Sarah Chen, Marcus, and several other staff members. They talked about practical changes, about recognizing bias, about treating everyone who walked through their doors with equal respect. The key, Will explained, is understanding that luxury isn't about exclusion. It's about excellence. And excellence should be available to anyone who can afford it, regardless of how they look. Sarah wrote everything down, her phone's notes app filling with actionable items and genuine insights. This wasn't going to be another corporate diversity training. This was going to be real change. As the evening drew to a close, Marcus spoke up one final time. Mr. Smith, what you did today, turning this into a teaching moment instead of a scandal. Thank you. Will smiled. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones. Just promise me something. When another black person walks into this store wearing a hoodie, remember today. I will, Marcus promised. And this time, everyone could hear the sincerity in his voice. Sarah walked Will to the door, where his assistant, Jake, waited to help navigate the media circus that had gathered outside. Ms. Chen, Will said quietly, what happens next is up to you. This can be just another viral moment, or it can be the beginning of real change. I choose change, she replied, firmly. We all do. As Will Smith finally left the store, Sarah turned back to face her staff and the remaining customers. The day's events had transformed her store into something more than a luxury retail space. It had become a place of learning, of growth, and of promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Media inquiries, corporate meetings, policy revisions. But tonight, in this moment, Sarah Chen knew that something profound had shifted, not just in her store, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed this remarkable transformation. The story would indeed go viral. The videos would be shared millions of times. But the real impact wasn't in the clicks or views. It was in the quiet determination of a store manager to do better, in the humbled recognition of a sales associate who had learned the hardest lesson of his career, and in the courage of a celebrity who chose education over outrage. As Sarah looked around her store one final time that evening, she knew that tomorrow would be different. And that was exactly the point. Over the next hour in the Gucci store, something remarkable unfolded. Marcus stood behind the counter, his hands still shaking slightly as he processed each briefcase purchase. But with every transaction, something in him was changing. You know, Will said, watching Marcus carefully enter the details for the 20th briefcase. I've been thinking about what made today different. Marcus looked up nervously. Different, sir? Yeah. I could have walked out, could have called TMZ myself, made a big scene. But then what would have changed? A small group of customers who had stayed throughout the entire incident nodded in agreement. Tanya, the woman who had shared her own story of discrimination earlier, spoke up. It's already changing. Look at Twitter. I mean, X. Your video is everywhere. But it's not what people expected. They're sharing their own stories in the comments. Will smiled softly. That's exactly what I hoped would happen. Marcus, how are those hands doing? Still shaking? Marcus paused in his typing, looking at his hands. Less now. I never thought I'd be having this kind of conversation. Especially not with Will Smith. Forget that I'm Will Smith, Will said, leaning on the counter. Think about me as just another human being who walked into your store today. What would you have done differently? The question hung in the air as Marcus processed another transaction. The store had grown quieter, everyone listening intently. I would have... Marcus started, his voice breaking slightly. I would have treated you like a person. Not a threat, not a stereotype. Just a person. Sarah Chen, who had been organizing the delivery details nearby, wiped a tear from her eye. That's what we all should do. Exactly. Will nodded. You know what the hardest part of today was? It wasn't the discrimination. I've faced that before. It was seeing how many other people in this store recognized the situation because they'd lived it themselves. A teenage girl who had been recording the entire interaction raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Smith, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. What's your name? Jessica. How do you stay so calm when people treat you like that? Will thought for a moment, watching as Marcus processed another briefcase. It's not about staying calm, Jessica. It's about choosing your response. Anger is easy. Teaching is harder. Marcus's hand stopped moving over the keyboard. I've been thinking about all the people I might have hurt before. People who didn't have your platform, who couldn't turn it into a teaching moment. That's the real cost, Will said quietly. Not the lost sales, but the lost dignity. The people who walk away feeling less than human. Sarah Chen stepped forward. We're implementing new training programs tomorrow. Real ones, not just corporate videos. Would you be willing to let us use this interaction as a teaching tool? On one condition, Will replied. Make sure it's about more than just avoiding bad publicity. Make it about genuine change. As Marcus processed the final few briefcases, the conversation deepened. People shared more stories, not just about retail discrimination, but about the small daily indignities they faced. The store had become something between a classroom and a confessional. Last transaction, Marcus announced, his voice steady for the first time in hours. Mr. Smith, I need to say something. Will looked up from signing the receipt. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Not just for today, but for every time I've done this before. For every person I made feel unwelcome. I want to do better. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Several customers wiped away tears. That's where it starts, Will said. With recognition and a genuine desire to change. The question is, what will you do with this lesson? Marcus straightened up behind the counter. I want to help with the new training program. Share my perspective, what I learned today. If that's okay, Ms. Chen. Sarah nodded immediately. More than okay. It's essential. Will gathered the final receipt, looking around the store one last time. You know what makes me hopeful? This didn't end with anger or accusations. It's ending with understanding and commitment to change. A young black couple who had witnessed the entire interaction stepped forward. Thank you, the woman said softly. Not just for standing up, but for showing us how to stand up with dignity. Will reached out to shake their hands. Remember this feeling. Remember that you belong anywhere you choose to be. Marcus came out from behind the counter, still emotional but standing straighter. Mr. Smith, before you go, can I share something personal? Of course. My grandfather. He was a shop owner in the 60s. He used to brag about turning away black customers. I thought I was different, better somehow. But today showed me I was carrying his legacy without even knowing it. Will placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The difference is, You got to see the impact. You got to choose a different path. That's how change happens. One person, one choice at a time. Sarah Chen approached with the final paperwork. The briefcases will be delivered tomorrow. Mr. Smith, I know this will go viral, but I want you to know, the real change will happen here, in this store, every day after this. That's exactly what I hope to hear. Will smiled. Sometimes the hardest conversations lead to the most important changes. As Will prepared to leave, navigating through the crowd that had gathered outside, Marcus called out one last time, "Mr. Smith, thank you for not giving up on me when you had every right to." Will turned back. "We're all works in progress, Marcus. The important thing is to keep progressing." The story did go viral, viewed over 50 million times across social media platforms. But the real impact wasn't in the numbers. It was in the conversations it sparked, the policies it changed, and the minds it opened. 1 month later, Marcus led his first sensitivity training session at the store. He started by showing the viral video of his interaction with Will Smith, then shared his journey of recognition and change. The room was packed with retail workers from across Beverly Hills, all eager to learn. Sarah Chen implemented new store policies that became a model for the entire luxury retail industry. The incident sparked a national conversation about retail, discrimination, and racial profiling, leading to changes far beyond that one store on Rodeo Drive. But perhaps the most significant change was in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed that day. They saw how a moment of discrimination could be transformed into an opportunity for growth, how anger could be channeled into education, and how one person's dignity could inspire thousands to examine their own biases. The briefcases were delivered to Jaden's graduating class as planned. Each one came with a note that read, "Your worth isn't determined by how others see you, but by how you see yourself. Never let anyone make you feel less than who you are." And in a luxury store on Rodeo Drive, a young sales associate learned the most valuable lesson of his career, that true luxury isn't about exclusivity, but about humanity. The story would be told for years to come, not just as a moment of celebrity confrontation, but as a masterclass in turning discrimination into dialogue and conflict into change. The aftermath of the incident rippled through the retail industry. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself in a unique position, from being the face of retail discrimination to becoming an advocate for change. "It's still surreal," he confided to Sarah Chen one morning, as they prepared for another training session. "Sometimes I watch that video and can't believe that was me." The training room was filled with retail workers from various luxury stores along Rodeo Drive. The atmosphere was different from typical corporate training sessions. There was an authenticity, a rawness to these gatherings. "Today," Marcus began, standing before his colleagues, "I'm going to show you a video that changed my life. But first, I want you to know, this isn't about shame. It's about growth." As the video played, showing his interaction with Will Smith, Marcus watched his audience's reactions. Some shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own behaviors in his actions. Others wiped away tears. "I used to think I was just doing my job," Marcus continued after the video ended, "protecting expensive merchandise. But what I was really doing was perpetuating a cycle of hurt." A sales associate from another luxury store raised her hand. "How do you balance security concerns with treating everyone fairly?" "That's the question I get most often." Marcus nodded. "But think about it. Did following Mr. Smith around the store make it more secure? Or did it just make us look prejudiced and cost us not only a major sale, but also our dignity?" Sarah Chen stepped forward. "Since implementing our new policies, our loss prevention numbers haven't increased, but our customer satisfaction scores have skyrocketed. The changes weren't just statistical. The store's atmosphere had transformed. Customers of all backgrounds browsed freely, without the weight of suspicious glances. The staff had learned to approach everyone with the same level of respect and service." One afternoon, about 2 months after the incident, a teenage boy in a hoodie walked into the store. Marcus watched as a new sales associate approached him with genuine warmth. "Welcome to Gucci," she said, smiling. "Can I help you find anything?" The boy, initially tense, relaxed visibly. "Yeah, actually. I'm looking for a wallet for my mom's birthday." Marcus smiled, remembering Will Smith's words. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones. The video had indeed gone viral, surpassing 50 million views across platforms. But the real victory wasn't in the numbers. It was in moments like these, when a young person could walk into a luxury store and be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance. Sarah had kept her promise about implementing real change. The store's new training program became a model for the entire company, then for the industry. Other retailers began reaching out, wanting to learn from their experience. "You know what the biggest change is?" Sarah remarked during one training session. "It's not in our policies or procedures. It's in our hearts. We've learned to see people, not stereotypes." The briefcases Will Smith purchased that day had become symbols of something larger. Each recipient in Jaden's graduating class received not just a luxury item, but a powerful message about dignity and respect. Marcus kept the receipt from that final transaction pinned to his desk, not as a reminder of shame, but as a testament to the possibility of change. He'd learned that true luxury wasn't about exclusivity or price tags. It was about treating every human being with inherent dignity. The story continued to be shared, not just as a viral moment or a celebrity encounter, but as a masterclass in handling discrimination with grace and turning conflict into opportunity. The real test, Marcus often said during training sessions, isn't how we treat celebrities. It's how we treat every single person who walks through those doors. And in that spirit, the luxury store on Rodeo Drive became more than just a place to buy expensive things. It became a testament to the power of learning from mistakes, of choosing education over anger, and of believing in the possibility of change. The end of this story wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning of new policies, new attitudes, and new ways of seeing each other. In that sense, Will Smith's response to discrimination that day had achieved exactly what he'd hoped. Not just a viral moment, but a lasting transformation.